A prison, also known as a jail, penitentiary, detention center, correction center, correctional facility, or remand center, is a facility where people are imprisoned under the authority of the state, usually as punishment for various crimes. They may also be used to house those awaiting trial, pre-trial detention. Prisons serve two primary functions within the criminal justice system: holding people charged with crimes while they await trial, and confining those who have pleaded guilty or been convicted to serve out their sentences. Prisons can also be used as a tool for political repression by authoritarian regimes who detain perceived opponents for political crimes, often without a fair trial or due process. This use is illegal under most forms of international law governing fair administration of justice. In times of war, belligerents or neutral countries may detain prisoners of war or detainees in military prisons or in prisoner of war camps. At any time, states may imprison civilians, sometimes large groups of civilians, in internment camps. Prisons employ people to run and maintain the prison while keeping control of the inmates. Oftentimes, the number of people employed within a prison depends upon factors such as the size of the prison, how many inmates the prison has, and how much funding the prison gets. Staff may include: the warden, also known as a governor, is the official who is in charge of the prison and heads all the staff. Security staff, also known as prison guards, are enforcement officials who are in charge of enforcing prison rules among the inmates. Thus they are responsible for the care, custody, and control of the prison. Teachers are employed to provide education for inmates to use after their release, in order to reduce the likelihood of the inmates reoffending. Case managers are people who perform correctional case work in an institutional setting. They develop, evaluate, and analyze program needs and other data about inmates, evaluate progress of individual offenders in the institution, coordinate and integrate inmate training programs, develop social histories, evaluate positive and negative aspects in each case situation, and develop release plans. Prison counselors are people who are employed to intervene therapeutically with various clients, the majority of whom happen to be offenders. These interventions include prison adjustment, pre-release and post-release vocational and marital/family readjustment, and work with adolescent adjustment problems. Medical workers are doctors and nurses who are tasked with providing the inmates with health care. A work release supervisor is someone who is tasked with monitoring inmates outside of the prison during a work release program. In private prisons, contractors are people who pay the prison for the use of prison labor and supply the prisoners with work. Prisons may also provide religious workers to meet the religious need for inmates. Religious workers are also in charge of the weddings when inmates marry someone outside the prison. In addition to the prison staff, inmate labor may be utilized for tasks within the prison, such as cooking food for the other inmates or providing cleaning services. Design. Prisons are normally surrounded by fencing, walls, earthworks, geographical features, or other barriers to prevent escape. Multiple barriers, concertina wire, electrified fencing, secured and defensible main gates, armed guard towers, security lighting, motion sensors, dogs and roving patrols may all also be present depending on the level of security. Remotely controlled doors, CCTV monitoring, alarms, cages, restraints, non-lethal and lethal weapons, riot control gear, and physical segregation of units and prisoners may all also be present within a prison to monitor and control the movement and activity of prisoners within the facility. Modern prison designs have increasingly sought to restrict and control the movement of prisoners throughout the facility and also to allow a smaller prison staff to monitor prisoners directly, often using a decentralized podular layout. In comparison, 19th-century prisons had large landings and cell blocks which permitted only intermittent observation of prisoners. Smaller, separate, and self-contained housing units known as pods or modules are designed to hold 16 to 50 prisoners and are arranged around exercise yards or support facilities in a decentralized campus pattern. A few prison officers, or sometimes only one, supervise each pod. The pods contain tiers of cells arranged around a central control station or desk from which a single officer can monitor all the cells and the entire pod, control cell doors and communicate with the rest of the prison. Pods may be designed for high-security indirect supervision, in which officers in segregated and sealed control booths monitor smaller numbers of prisoners confined to their cells. An alternative is direct supervision, in which officers work within the pod and directly interact with and supervise prisoners, who may spend the day outside their cells in a central dayroom on the floor of the pod. Movement in or out of the pod to and from exercise yards, work assignments, or medical appointments can be restricted to individual pods at designated times and is generally centrally controlled. Goods and services, such as meals, laundry, commissary, educational materials, religious services, and medical care can increasingly be brought to individual pods or cells as well. Some modern prisons may exclude certain inmates from the general population, usually for safety reasons, such as those within solitary confinement, celebrities, political figures, former law enforcement officers, those convicted of sexual crimes and/or crimes against children, or those on the medical wing or protective custody. Generally, when an inmate arrives at a prison, they go through a security classification screening and risk assessment that determines where they will be placed within the prison system. Classifications are assigned by assessing the prisoner's personal history, criminal record, escape potential and through subjective determinations made by intake personnel, which include mental health workers, counselors, clerical staff, sheriff deputies, prison unit managers, and others. This process will have a major impact on the prisoner's experience, determining their security level, educational and work programs, mental health status, e.g. the determination of whether they will be placed in a mental health unit, and many other factors. This sorting of prisoners is one of the fundamental techniques through which the prison administration maintains control over the inmate population and attempts to reduce risks and liabilities by creating an orderly and secure prison environment. In some countries, prisoners are made to wear a prison uniform and are stripped of nearly all personal possessions, with the exception of approved medical devices like glasses. The levels of security within a prison system are categorized differently around the world, but tend to follow a distinct pattern. At one end of the spectrum are the most secure facilities, maximum security, which typically hold prisoners that are considered dangerous, disruptive, or likely to try to escape. Furthermore, in recent times, supermax prisons have been created where the custody level goes beyond maximum security for people such as terrorists or political prisoners deemed a threat to national security, and inmates from other prisons who have a history of violent or other disruptive behavior in prison or are suspected of gang affiliation. These inmates have individual cells and are kept in lockdown, often for more than 23 hours per day. Meals are served through chuck holes in the cell door, and each inmate is allowed 1 hour of outdoor exercise per day, alone. They are normally permitted no contact with other inmates and are under constant surveillance via closed-circuit television cameras. On the other end are minimum security prisons, which are most often used to house those for whom more stringent security is deemed unnecessary. For example, prisoners convicted of white-collar crime, which rarely results in incarceration, are almost always sent to minimum security prisons due to them having committed nonviolent crimes. Lower security prisons are often designed with less restrictive features, confining prisoners at night in smaller locked dormitories or even cottage or cabin-like housing while permitting them free movement around the grounds to work or partake in activities during the day. Some countries, such as Great Britain, also have open prisons where prisoners are allowed home leave or part-time employment outside of the prison. Suomenlinna prison in Finland is an example of one such open correctional facility. The prison has been open since 1971 and, as of September 2013, the facility's 95 male prisoners leave the prison grounds on a daily basis to work in the corresponding township or commute to the mainland for either work or study. Prisoners can rent flat-screen televisions, sound systems, and mini refrigerators with the prison labor wages that they can earn. Wages range between €4.10 and €7.30 per hour. With electronic monitoring, Prisoners are also allowed to visit their families in Helsinki and eat together with the prison staff. Prisoners in Scandinavian facilities are permitted to wear their own clothes. There are fundamental differences between the security level of men's prisons and that of women's prisons. Male prisons tend to have higher, or more severe, security levels/classifications than female prisons. This is even noticeable when comparing the construction and design of male prisons, which tend to have very tall walls and towers, barbed wire and other serious security measures, whereas these types of high-level security measures are absent at many female prisons. This is due to multiple factors, including females being convicted of less severe offenses and being less likely to be convicted of violent offenses, in comparison to males, and due to female prisoners being less likely to be violent than male prisoners. Common facilities. Modern prisons often hold hundreds or thousands of inmates and must have facilities on site to meet most of their needs, including dietary, health, fitness, education, religious practices, entertainment, and many others. Conditions in prisons vary widely around the world, and the types of facilities within prisons depend on many intersecting factors, including funding, legal requirements, and cultural beliefs/practices. Nevertheless, in addition to the cell blocks that contain the prisoners, there are also certain auxiliary facilities that are common in prisons throughout the world. Prisons generally have to provide food for a large number of individuals and thus are generally equipped with a large institutional kitchen. There are many security considerations, however, that are unique to the prison dining environment. For instance, cutlery equipment must be very carefully monitored and accounted for at all times, and the layout of prison kitchens must be designed in a way that allows staff to observe activity of the kitchen staff, who are usually prisoners. The quality of kitchen equipment varies from prison to prison, depending on when the prison was constructed and the level of funding available to procure new equipment. Prisoners are often served food in a large cafeteria with rows of tables and benches that are securely attached to the floor. However, inmates that are locked in control units or prisons that are on lockdown, where prisoners are made to remain in their cells all day, have trays of food brought to their cells and served through chuck holes in the cell door. Prison food in many developed countries is nutritionally adequate for most inmates. Prisons in wealthy, industrialized nations provide medical care for most of their inmates. Prison medical staff play a major role in monitoring, organizing, and controlling the prison population through the use of psychiatric evaluations and interventions, psychiatric drugs, isolation in mental health units, etc. Prison populations are largely from poor minority communities that experience greater rates of chronic illness, substance abuse, and mental illness than the general population. This leads to a high demand for medical services, and in countries such as the US that do not provide taxpayer-funded health care, prison is often the first place that people are able to receive medical treatment, which they could not afford outside. Some prison medical facilities include primary care, mental health services, dental care, substance abuse treatment, and other forms of specialized care, depending on the needs of the inmate population and the willingness of the prison to provide for these needs. Healthcare services in many prisons have long been criticized as inadequate, underfunded, and understaffed, and many prisoners have experienced abuse and mistreatment at the hands of prison medical staff who are entrusted with their care. In the United States, 1 million incarcerated people suffer from mental illness without any assistance or treatment for their condition. The tendency of a convicted criminal to reoffend, known as the rate of recidivism, is unusually high for those with the most serious disorders. Analysis of data in 2000 from several forensic hospitals in California, New York, and Oregon found that with treatment the rate of recidivism was much lower than for untreated mentally ill offenders. Some prisons provide educational programs for inmates that can include basic literacy, secondary education, or even college education. Prisoners seek education for a variety of reasons, including the development of skills for after release, personal enrichment, and curiosity, finding something to fill their time, or trying to please prison staff, which can often secure early release for good behavior. However, The educational needs of prisoners often come into conflict with the security concerns of prison staff and with a public that wants to be tough on crime, and thus supports denying prisoners access to education. Whatever their reasons for participating in educational programs, prison populations tend to have very low literacy rates and lack of basic mathematical skills, and many have not completed secondary education. This lack of basic education severely limits their employment opportunities outside of prison, leading to high rates of recidivism. Research has shown that prison education can play a significant role in helping prisoners reorient their lives and become successful after reentry. Many prisons also provide a library where prisoners can check out books or do legal research for their cases. Often these libraries are very small, consisting of a few shelves of books. In some countries, such as the United States, drastic budget cuts have resulted in many prison libraries being shut down. Meanwhile, many nations that have historically lacked prison libraries are starting to develop them. Prison libraries can dramatically improve the quality of life for prisoners, who have large amounts of empty time on their hands that can be occupied with reading. This time spent reading has a variety of benefits including improved literacy, ability to understand rules and regulations, leading to improved behavior, ability to read books that encourage self-reflection and analysis of one's emotional state, consciousness of important real-world events, and education that can lead to successful re-entry into society after release. In 2024, the American Library Association published standards for library services for the incarcerated or detained. Under the Federal Bureau of Prisons in the United States, all prison institutions offer literacy programs to expand inmates' educational opportunities. Some scholars in the field see prison literacy programs as organic, tactical spaces that resist institutionalization. They warn against the dehumanizing nature of rehabilitative practices and encourage the maintenance of agency and control in these programs to prevent them from becoming self-serving entities that cause further exploitation. Others argue that certain education systems are falsely advertised as a perfect solution when in reality there are much larger systemic issues at hand. Rather than trying to shape inmates into helpful workforce members upon release, scholars like Michael Sutcliffe argue that there needs to be a focus on re-enfranchising members and helping them share their voices. Still others advocate for styles of collective life writing to capture the experience of incarcerated individuals and fight against exclusionary institutions. Taking an alternative approach, queer literacy frameworks have also been supported by scholars like Alexandra Cavallero who see the incorporation of LGBTQ individuals' stories as key to promoting lifelong learning. Keeping forward solutions in mind, rhetorical listening is a final approach that is spread by leaders like Wendy Hinshaw. Many prisons provide limited recreational and fitness facilities for prisoners. The provision of these services is controversial, with certain elements of society claiming that prisons are being soft on inmates, and others claiming that it is cruel and dehumanizing to confine people for years without any recreational opportunities. The tension between these two opinions, coupled with lack of funding, leads to a large variety of different recreational procedures at different prisons. Prison administrators, however, generally find the provision of recreational opportunities to be useful at maintaining order in the prisons, because it keeps prisoners occupied and provides leverage to gain compliance, by depriving prisoners of recreation as punishment. Examples of common facilities/programs that are available in some prisons are gyms and weightlifting rooms, arts and crafts, games, such as cards, chess or bingo, television sets, and sports teams. Additionally, many prisons have an outdoor recreation area, commonly referred to as an exercise yard. Most prisoners are part of the general population, or Gen Pop, of the prison, members of which are generally able to socialize with each other in common areas of the prison. A control unit or segregation unit, also called a block or isolation cell, is a highly secure area of the prison, where inmates are placed in solitary confinement to isolate them from the general population. Other prisoners that are often segregated from the general population include those who are in protective custody, or who are on suicide watch, and those whose behavior presents a threat to other prisoners. In addition to the above facilities, others that are common include prison factories and workshops, visiting areas, mail rooms, telephone and computer rooms, a prison store, often called a canteen, where prisoners can purchase goods with prison commissary. Some prisons have a death row where prisoners who have been sentenced to death await execution, and an execution room, where the death sentence is carried out. In places like Singapore and Malaysia, there is place for corporal punishment, carried out by caning. Prisons for juveniles are known by a variety of names, including youth detention facilities, juvenile detention centers, and reformatories. The purpose of youth detention facilities is to keep young offenders away from the public while working towards rehabilitation. The idea of separately treating youthful and adult offenders is a relatively modern idea. The earliest known use of the term juvenile delinquency was in London in 1816, from where it quickly spread to the United States. The first juvenile correctional institution in the United States opened in 1825 in New York City. By 1917, juvenile courts had been established in all but 3 states. It was estimated that in 2011 more than 95,000 juveniles were locked up in prisons and jails in the United States, the largest youth prisoner population in the world. Besides prisons, many other types of residential placement exist within juvenile justice systems, including youth homes, community-based programs, training schools, and boot camps. Like adult facilities, youth detention centers in some countries are experiencing overcrowding due to large increases in incarceration rates of young offenders. Crowding can create extremely dangerous environments in juvenile detention centers and juvenile correctional facilities. Overcrowding may also lead to the decrease in availability to provide the youth with much needed and promised programs and services while they are in the facility. Many times the administration is not prepared to handle the large number of residents, and therefore the facilities can become unstable and create instability in simple logistics. In addition to overcrowding, juvenile prisons are questioned for their overall effectiveness in rehabilitating youth. Many critics note high juvenile recidivism rates, and the fact that most of the youths that are incarcerated are those from lower socio-economic classes, who often suffer from broken families, lack of educational/job opportunities, and violence in their communities. Women's prisons. In the 19th century, a growing awareness that female prisoners had different needs to male prisoners led to the establishment of dedicated prisons for women. In modern times, it is the norm for female inmates to be housed in either a separate prison or a separate wing of a unisex prison. The aim is to protect them from physical and sexual abuse that would otherwise occur. In the Western world, the guards of women's prisons are usually female, though not always. For example, in federal women's correction facilities of the United States, 70% of guards are male. Rape and sexual offenses remain commonplace in many women's prisons and are usually underreported. 2 studies in the late 2000s noted that because a high proportion of female inmates have experienced sexual abuse in the past, they are particularly vulnerable to further abuse. The needs of mothers during pregnancy and childbirth often conflict with the demands of the prison system. The Rebecca Project, a nonprofit organization that campaigns for women's rights issues, reports that in 2007, the Bureau of Justice Statistics stated that, on average, 5% of women who enter into state prisons are pregnant, and in jails local prisons 6% of women are pregnant. The standard of care that female prisoners receive before and after giving birth is often far worse than the standard expected by the general population, and sometimes almost none is given. In some countries, female prisoners may be restrained while giving birth. In many countries, including the United States, mothers will frequently be separated from their baby after giving birth. Research has shown a significant link between females in prison and brain injury, which supports research that shows incarcerated females are overwhelmingly victims of domestic violence, mainly male violence against women. Prisons have formed parts of military systems since the French Revolution. France set up its system in 1796. They were modernized in 1852 and, since their existence, are used variously to house prisoners of war, unlawful combatants, those whose freedom is deemed a national security risk by military or civilian authorities, and members of the military found guilty of a serious crime. Military prisons in the United States have also been converted to civilian prisons, for example, Alcatraz Island. Alcatraz was formerly a military prison for soldiers during the American Civil War. In the American Revolution, British prisoners held by the U.S. were assigned to local farmers as laborers. The British kept American sailors in broken-down ship hulls with high death rates. In the Napoleonic Wars, the broken-down hulks were still in use for naval prisoners. One French surgeon recalled his captivity in Spain, where scurvy, diarrhea, dysentery, and typhus abounded, and prisoners died by the thousands. These great trunks of ships were immense coffins, in which living men were consigned to a slow death. In the hot weather we had black army bread full of gritty particles, biscuit full of maggots, salt meat that was already decomposing, rancid lard, spoiled cod, and stale rice, peas, and beans. In the American Civil War, at first prisoners of war were released after they promised not to fight again unless formally exchanged. When the Confederacy refused to exchange black prisoners, the system broke down and each side built large-scale POW camps. Conditions in terms of housing, food, and medical care were bad in the Confederacy, and the Union retaliated by imposing harsh conditions. By 1900, the legal framework of the Geneva and Hague Convention provided considerable protection. In the First World War, millions of prisoners were held on both sides, with no major atrocities. Officers received privileged treatment. There was an increase in the use of forced labor throughout Europe. Food and medical treatment were generally comparable to what active duty soldiers received, and housing was much better than front-line conditions. Political prisoners are people who have been imprisoned because of their political beliefs, activities, and affiliations. There is much debate about who qualifies as a political prisoner. The category of political prisoner is often contested, and many regimes that incarcerate political prisoners often claim that they are merely criminals. Others who are sometimes classified as political prisoners include prisoners who were politicized in prison and are subsequently punished for their involvement with political causes. Many countries maintain or have in the past had a system of prisons specifically intended for political prisoners. In some countries, dissidents can be detained, tortured, executed, and/or disappeared without trial. This can happen either legally or extra-legally, sometimes by falsely accusing people and fabricating evidence against them. Administrative detention is a classification of prisons or detention centers where people are held without trial. Some psychiatric facilities have characteristics of prisons, particularly when confining patients who have committed a crime and are considered dangerous. In addition, many prisons have psychiatric units dedicated to housing offenders diagnosed with a wide variety of mental disorders. The United States government refers to psychiatric prisons housing federal inmates as federal medical centers, FMC. Prison population. In 2021, the World Prison Brief reported that at least 11.5 million people were imprisoned worldwide. In 2021, the United States of America had the world's largest prison population, with over 2 million people in American prisons or jails, up from 744,000 in 1985, making 1 in every 200 American adults a prisoner. In 2017, the nonprofit organization Prison Policy Initiative estimated that the United States government spent an estimated $80.7 billion to maintain prisons. CNBC estimated that the cost of maintaining the U.S. prison system was $74 billion per year. This increases government spending on prisons. As of 2023, the U.S. no longer has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with El Salvador now having the highest. Not all countries have experienced a rise in prison population. Sweden closed 4 prisons in 2013 due to a significant drop in the number of inmates. The head of Sweden's prison and probation services characterized the decrease in the number of Swedish prisoners as out of the ordinary, with prison numbers in Sweden falling by around 1% a year since 2004. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime website hosts data regarding prison populations around the world, including persons held by sex, by age group, persons held by status and sex, and prison capacity and overcrowding totals. Economics of prisons. In the United States alone, more than $74 billion per year is spent on prisons, with over 800,000 people employed in the prison industry. As the prison population grows, revenues increase for a variety of small and large businesses that construct facilities and provide equipment, security systems, furniture, clothing and services, transportation, communications, healthcare, food, for prisons. These parties have a strong interest in the expansion of the prison system since their development and prosperity directly depends on the number of inmates. The prison industry also includes private businesses that benefit from the exploitation of the prison labor. Some scholars, using the term prison industrial complex, have argued that the trend of hiring out prisoners is a continuation of the slavery tradition, pointing out that the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution freed slaves but allowed forced labor for people convicted of crimes. Prisons are very attractive to employers, because prisoners can be made to perform a great array of jobs under conditions that most free laborers would not accept, and would be illegal outside of prison's sub-minimum wage payments, no insurance, no collective bargaining, lack of alternative options, etc. Prison labor can soon deprive the free labor of jobs in a number of sectors, since the organized labor turns out to be uncompetitive compared to the prison counterpart. Prisons can be difficult places to live and work in, even in developed countries in the present day. By their very definition, prisons house individuals who may be prone to violence and rule breaking. It is also typical that a high proportion of inmates have mental health concerns. A 2014 U.S. report found that this included 64% of local jail inmates, 54% of state prisoners and 45% of federal prisoners. The environment may be worsened by overcrowding, poor sanitation and maintenance, violence by prisoners against other prisoners or staff misconduct, prison gangs, self-harm, and the widespread smuggling of illegal drugs and other contraband. The social system within the prison commonly develops an inmate code, an informal set of internal values and rules that govern prison life and relationships, but that may be at odds with the interests of prison management or external society, compromising future rehabilitation and increasing recidivism rates. In some cases, disorder can escalate into a full-scale prison riot, which could lead to serious injury or death en masse. Academic research has found that poor conditions tend to increase the likelihood of violence within prisons. For example, according to Gies and McGuire study, as social density increased by 1% in prisons, violence increased about 0.3%. External. Prisoners can face difficulty reintegrating back into society upon their release. They often have difficulty finding work, earn less money when they do find work, and experience a wide range of medical and psychological issues. Many countries have a high recidivism rate. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 67.8% of released prisoners in the United States are rearrested within 3 years and 76.6% are rearrested within 5 years. If the prisoner has a family, they are likely to suffer socially and economically from the prisoner's absence. If a society has a very high imprisonment rate, these effects become noticeable not just on family units but also on entire poor communities or communities of color. The expensive cost of maintaining a high imprisonment rate also costs money that must come at the expense of either the taxpayer or other government agencies. Theories of punishment and criminality. A variety of justifications and explanations are put forth for why people are imprisoned by the state. The most common of these are rehabilitation. Theories of rehabilitation argue that the purpose of imprisonment is to change prisoners' lives in a way that will make them productive and law-abiding members of society once they are released. The idea was promoted by 19th-century reformers, who promoted prisons as a humane alternative to harsh punishments of the past. Many governments and prison systems have adopted rehabilitation as an official aim. In the United States and Canada, prison agencies are often referred to as corrections services for this reason. Deterrence. Theories of deterrence argue that by sentencing criminals to extremely harsh penalties, other people who might be considering criminal activities will be so terrified of the consequences that they will choose not to commit crimes out of fear. Incapacitation. Theories of incapacitation argue that while prisoners are incarcerated, they will be unable to commit crimes, thus keeping communities safer. Retribution. Theories of retributive justice argue that the purpose of imprisonment is to cause punitive damages to the prisoner, in proportion to the perceived seriousness of their crime. These theories do not necessarily focus on whether or not a particular punishment benefits the community, but instead are based upon a belief that some kind of moral balance will be achieved by paying back the prisoner for the wrongs they have committed. Modern prison reform movements generally seek to reduce prison populations. A key goal is to improve conditions by reducing overcrowding. Prison reformers also argue that alternative methods are often better at rehabilitating offenders and preventing crime in the long term. Countries that have sought to actively reduce prison populations include Sweden, Germany, and the Netherlands. Alternatives to prison sentences include fines, community service, capital punishment. Suspended sentence. The offender performs of a period of probation and only serves a prison sentence if the terms of probation are broken. This is similar to the Canadian concept of a conditional sentence. House arrests/curfews, sometimes a condition of a strict suspended/conditional sentence. Mandatory treatment for drug offenders. Rehabilitation programs, such as anger management classes. Mental health treatment for offenders with mental illness. Judicial corporal punishment. Conditional discharge. The offender is not punished for the crime if they abide by certain conditions, typically they must not commit any further crimes within a designated period. Other court orders that take away privileges from the offender, such as banning motoring offenders from driving. Restorative justice programs, which overlap with the above methods. Restorative justice is based around arranging a mediation between the offender and victim, so that the offenders can take responsibility for their actions, to repair the harm they've done by apologizing, returning stolen money, or community service. These alternatives do not eliminate the need for imprisonment altogether. Suspended sentences entail the threat of time in prison, while for others, actual imprisonment may be used as a punishment for non-compliance. The prison abolition movement seeks to eliminate prisons altogether. It is distinct from prison reform, although abolitionists often support reform campaigns, regarding them as incremental steps towards abolishing prisons. The abolition movement is motivated by a belief that prisons are inherently ineffective and discriminatory. The movement is associated with libertarian socialism, anarchism and anti-authoritarianism, with some prison abolitionists arguing that imprisoning people for actions the state designates as crimes is not only inexpedient but also immoral. In many prisons, violence committed by other prisoners or staff is frequent. Prisons have been criticized for frequently not prosecuting crimes committed within the prison. A large percentage of former prisoners commit crimes after their release from prison. Recidivism. Recidivism data was found from 33 countries, with results showing released prisoners having a 2-year reconviction rates between 18% and 55%, while individuals given community sentences had rates between 10% and 47%. The argument that prisons can reduce crime through incapacitation is widely accepted, even among academics who doubt that prisons can rehabilitate or deter offenders. One dissenting argument is from Arrigo and Milovanovic, who argue that prisoners will simply continue to victimize people inside of the prison and that this harm has impacts on the society outside. Academic studies have been inconclusive as to whether high imprisonment rates reduce crime rates in comparison to low imprisonment rates. Only a minority suggest it creates a significant reduction, and others suggest it increases crime. Prisoners are at risk of being drawn further into crime, as they may become acquainted with other criminals, trained in further criminal activity, exposed to further abuse, both from staff and other prisoners, and left with criminal records that make it difficult to find legal employment after release. All of these things can result in a higher likelihood of reoffending upon release. This has resulted in a series of studies that are skeptical towards the idea that prison can rehabilitate offenders. As Morris and Rothman, 1995, point out, it's hard to train for freedom in a cage. Prison reform organizations such as the Howard League for Penal Reform are not entirely opposed to attempting to rehabilitate offenders, but instead argue that most prisoners would be more likely to be rehabilitated if they received a punishment other than prison. The National Institute of Justice argues that offenders can be deterred by the fear of being caught but are unlikely to be deterred by the fear or experience of the punishment. Like Lawrence W. Sherman, they argue that better policing is a more effective way to reduce crime rates. Prisons and marginalized groups. People with disabilities. People with disabilities are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, with 40% of people in state prisons having disabilities compared to 15% of the general population. Factors that may contribute to this are lack of social support, lack of effective communication with law enforcement or legal representation, poverty, bias and prejudice, and mental health issues, among others. The Department of Justice reported that people with disabilities were victims of 26% of non-fatal violent crimes while being accounted for 15% of the population from 2017 to 2019, in addition to being 4 times as likely to be a victim of a violent crime, 46.2 per 1,000 age 12 or older, than those without a disability, 12.3 per 1,000. And with police often being the first responders to mental health crises, this can increase the chance of conflicts with the mentally ill. In 2015, a Washington Post investigation reported that 124 people out of 462 for whom police were called for assistance with a person in an immediate mental health crisis were shot by the first responders. Most of those shot were armed in the interaction, however. The National Registry of Exonerations found that 70% of people who falsely confessed and were later exonerated had intellectual disabilities and mental illness. Those with intellectual disabilities were exonerated from murder in 69% of cases, with 29% of those being exonerated from the death penalty compared to 13% of the total exonerations. Black people. Black people make up 13% of the population, make up 37% of the prison population. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention has found that in 2020, 4,223.1 out of 100,000 black people of all ages were arrested compared to 92.1 white people out 100,000. At the end of 2017, federal and state prison population for blacks was 475,000, compared to 436,000 of whites. 10 years earlier, there were only 592,000 of black people and 330,000 white people in prison. Thank you for watching this video.